Okay, so we're just going to have a brief part two to sort of help frame our civil rights conversation. So this image here on the top left is of Kennedy with civil rights leaders. Should remind us a bit of that image that we looked at with Eisenhower and civil rights leaders, to just continue to suggest that this movement, this civil rights movement, is not new in this country. And although when we reference the civil rights movement, we're typically referencing the 50s and 60s. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, these are all figures that we have been talking about for a long time. So it's definitely a continuation of the conversation. And then the picture on the top right is Dr. King with Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy Jr., or not Robert Kennedy Jr., Robert Kennedy, who we will or did talk about prior to this. He is also assassinated after his brother when he runs for the Democratic nomination. When Kennedy is elected, he had campaigned on a promise of civil rights reform, but he, as a politician, weighs the idea of pushing his agenda forward while still needing to balance it with a need. I'm trying not to reuse words, but I'm just going to. So he is campaigning on a promise to pass civil rights reforms, but he also needs to balance that promise that he made during the campaign with the actual very real need to pass legislation with the help of Southern Democrats. Because if he doesn't have Southern Democrats, he can't advance any aspect of his agenda, not just civil rights. So politically, he's trying to avoid burning bridges on the civil rights issue that could impact other things that he wants to do as president. So what does he do that doesn't necessarily need the help of Southern Democrats? Well, he's going to appoint African Americans to government positions. He will give Thurgood Marshall, who we discussed, a judgeship. He forms a committee on equal employment opportunity, and he appoints Robert Kennedy over the Department of Justice, who is extremely involved in supporting civil rights issues from within the DOJ. He also calls for a quote-unquote cooling off period after the Freedom Rider attacks. Leaders like James Farmer, who's the leader of CORE, are angry by this approach. We don't need to cool off. We need to push forward. You need to punish those segregationists at fault here. He will also order the DOJ to tighten ICC controls. It's going to be the Interstate Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Commission, that will ultimately be responsible for legislating who and how segregation and integration can be implemented on interstate buses. And bus segregation is virtually over by 1962. Martin Luther King Jr. is also going to pick up steam in terms of the number of demonstrations that he is leading by 1963. He is trying to get national attention. So in other words, what he is trying to do and what he understands really well is the press to a certain degree. How do you control, how do you manage what images get put on the front page of the paper in a northern city? That's what's going to change public opinion when people in the north start understanding what's going on in the south. So he's exposing or bringing to light, not just for Southerners, the violence that takes place in the struggle for civil rights, but also for people in other parts of the country who don't have a front row seat to the civil rights movement. He's arrested at one point and pens this very moving letter, the letter from Birmingham jail, which is actually incredibly long, where he lays out what his plan is in the civil rights movement. You've probably read that in English class. Bull Connor, who we know is the police commissioner in Birmingham, will authorize the use of violent force against civil rights marchers. And so on May 2nd, there is a very well-organized children's march. This is a hard call, right? I mean, how do you as a parent allow your children to participate in something like this? A lot of kids ended up participating without their parents' knowledge. There were parents who refused to let their children participate. But, you know, King and other leaders decided that, A, they hoped violence would be less likely to be used against kids, right? But B, they knew these kids would be arrested, and they were. What does a front page look like when you are arresting a 10-year-old? What impact does that have on the national consciousness when it comes to segregation and protests? So that's a very calculated decision. On September 15th, 1963, you have the horrific bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 young girls pictured there on the right are killed. Here is a little clip. I think I could, oh, here, let me just play it small.
It was the oldest black church in Birmingham, and it was fairly large. And so it made sense that meetings would happen there, which would also make it a target. On Sunday morning, September 15th, it was Youth Day, right after Sunday school. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robinson, Denise McNair, and Cynthia Wesley are getting ready to go into the choir.
I remember Addie, I was closest to Addie. We would go to church picnics. Addie and I just gravitated to each other.
Cynthia Wesley was a friend of mine. She was at my school. She was a 9th grader. Just started in September. And I was an 11th grader.
I remember Denise back there always smiling, and she was the only child. And I remember Carol Robinson being quiet. She played in the orchestra at her school.
Addie Mae's sister Sarah is also in that ladies' lounge. Sarah said the last thing that she remembers is seeing them helping each other tie on sashes, and then it went dark. We're talking about an explosion that reverberates through the entire city of Birmingham. Everybody heard it.
I was at South Illerton Baptist Church, and our pastor was shifting kind of nervously across the room and said he had received word that 16th Street Baptist Church had been bombed.
I was in Sunday school class. The building seemed like it was shaking off its foundation. Fumes, smelling fumes, and getting hit in the head. I couldn't find my younger sister. Only later to find out that she was taken to the hospital. She was only 4. She was cut in the head, blood dripping down her clothes and down her face.
Reverend John Cross comes down after the explosion to go into the hole and hears moaning.
My father heard somebody saying, Addie, Addie, and he realized that Sarah was calling her sister's name because that's the last voices that she heard before the explosion occurred.
They find the bodies, and they're almost literally stacked on top of each other.
He said they looked like they had been blown together.
It devastated me. It was just so painful to know that these girls were killed at church. They had not done anything to deserve something like that.
That was enough to pull people off the fence. Kids are supposed to be safe in church. This is not supposed to happen in America. We're above this kind of thing. And so this was the catalyst to get some things moving.
Okay. Horrific. There's a little excerpt down here from MLK. He says, "So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent, but I have tried to say that this is normal and healthy discontent can be channeled through the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. Now this approach is being dismissed as extremist. I must admit that I was initially disappointed in being so categorized." And he goes on to sort of embrace this idea. There's a lot of conversation around MLK as this nonviolent leader who didn't rock the boat. That's false. That's an untrue thing to say about Dr. King. He was considered to be an extremist. Nobody looked at his nonviolent marches and said, oh, they're protesting the right way. You might have heard that before, right? What is the right way to protest? What he knew was that and what he believed was that the way to get through to the rest of the country was by showing the violence of segregation against the nonviolent actions of his movement members. It wasn't about not being angry. It wasn't about not wanting to be violent. It was about being creative in the manner that you drew attention to the circumstance that you find yourself in. Violence will continue. This is a little video of a man named George Wallace. George Wallace will physically, he's the governor of Alabama, use his body to bar students from attending, the University of Alabama. This is also the same time period and the same area where Medgar Evers, a very notable civil rights activist, is killed. Kennedy will announce plans for a civil rights bill in 1963. We will have a march on Washington demanding that civil rights bill be passed, now, also in 1963. But we know Kennedy won't survive to see it passed. It will be Johnson, with his relationships in Congress with Southerners, and also using, this is what Kennedy would have wanted, that will get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, despite a filibuster in the Senate. There are those, including George Wallace, who feel very strongly that they will not abide by the desegregation that is called for in the Act.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
So, George Wallace will ultimately run a third-party candidacy for president. He obviously does not win. His wife will be a candidate for governor and win, so he will not only be governor of Alabama, but he will be married to the governor of Alabama. He does eventually repudiate his segregationism. Anyway, he is always around for a very long time. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, although it does those things that are mentioned there in green, it's also something worth noting that it's not as though the segregationists in the South woke up in 1965 and said, oh, okay, well, last year we passed the Civil Rights Act, and so we're going to make segregation illegal in public places. There continues to be challenges to these laws, and you don't change behaviors. You don't change hearts and minds with laws. You don't. You might get people to desegregate, but you don't end racist behavior. And remember, Southerners had been calling for massive resistance. Throw everything you have at this problem. Don't let desegregation happen. Well, desegregation happens, but they don't accept it. The 24th Amendment will also be ratified in 1964, eliminating the poll tax, but it can only eliminate poll taxes in federal elections only. And access to the ballot box remains an issue for African Americans. For example, in Selma, Alabama, African Americans are the majority in terms of the population, but make up only 3% of voters. Why is this the case? Intimidation and violence by people like a sheriff named Jim Clark in Selma, Alabama, will actively attempt to prevent African Americans from voting. So you see the protests after the Civil Rights Act is passed. you see the movement shift to a focus on voter registration. For example, the protests and march from Selma to Montgomery, which is about a 50-mile walk that is televised along the way. And the brutality that the protesters experience is also televised. One particularly tough day, horrible day for those marchers is known as Bloody Sunday. Ultimately, the outcry will lead to the passage of the Voter Rights Act in 1965 and the registration of more than 200,000 new African American voters. You start to see African Americans elected to Congress really in numbers that we haven't seen since Reconstruction. Their eyes on the prize.
600 people gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church on Sunday, March 7th, to begin the march to Montgomery. Dr. King was preaching in Atlanta. Hosea Williams and John Lewis led the march. Lewis chose to march even though his organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, opposed SCLC's strategy and decided not to take part. Surprisingly, as they walked through the center of town, there were no police in sight. The route out of Selma crossed over the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
It'll be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
President Johnson, sensing the mood of the country, addressed Congress on national television.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is
8 days after Bloody Sunday, 4 days after Reeb's death, the president asked for a comprehensive voting rights bill and astonished the nation by using the words of the movement.
Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Judge Johnson has just ruled that we have a legal and constitutional right to march from Selma to Montgomery.
The judge's action cleared the way for the march, but Governor Wallace still refused to provide the necessary protection. So President Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard. Sunday, March 21st, only 62 days after the campaign began, 3,200 people gathered at Brown Chapel Church for the journey to Montgomery.
We are going to walk non-violently and peacefully to let the nation and the world know we are tired now. We've lived with slavery and segregation 345 years. We waited a long time for freedom. We are trying to remind the nation of the urgency of the moment. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to transform Alabama, the heart of Dixie, to a state with a heart for brotherhood and peace and goodwill. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
marching on to freedom land. We're marching on to freedom land. 'Cause our strength from day to day as we walk the narrow way. We're going forward. We're moving forward. One day we're going to be free. We're marching on the freedom land.
54 miles and 5 days marching. They were now 25,000 strong.
As we travel the narrow way.
Marching together and listening to Martin's speech.
We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. That will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man. However difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long because truth crushed earth will rise again. How long? Not long. Because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. Because mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the village where the grapes of wrath are stored. He's loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
The bridge in Selma is called the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and there is I don't know if I would call it a movement. There's a call now among many people to rename the Edmund Pettus Bridge the John Lewis Bridge, which I think would be pretty phenomenal, actually. Again, attitudes don't change overnight. Legislation doesn't change the reality of poverty and discrimination among for many African Americans. There are riots that take place in Los Angeles, in Detroit, in Nashville, so much so that the federal government forms a commission. It's called the Kerner Commission, which issues a report in 1968. And it's essentially saying, like, study what's going on in our urban areas of the country. Why is there an increase in violence, etc.? And the findings of the Kerner report are really fascinating. They say, unless we intercede, unless something happens with poverty, our nation, quote, is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Dr. King, in his later years, and that's so crazy to say later years because he dies so young, but in the years before his death, had started to shift his attention. I shouldn't say shift, because he never moves away, obviously, from racial justice, but he starts to increasingly see economic justice as a crucial component of racial justice, and that there can be no racial equality without economic equality. So he begins to focus more on poverty, and the year he's killed, he is actually in the process of planning a poor man's march. Like, there had been a march on Washington, a poor man's march on Washington, where they would move through the Deep South, gathering poor people of all races as they went in this call for economic justice. And Memphis had sort of been a test to see if the different elements of that movement could come together and call for economic justice. And that's why he comes to Memphis, because that call, that strike that the garbage men go on, the sanitation workers go on in Memphis, is at its heart an economic justice argument. So something interesting to keep in mind. He had been in Chicago a whole lot in later years, and he was moving this conversation out of just the South to these large urban cities. He had also, it's important to say, had become really critical of the Vietnam War and had spoken out increasingly as an anti-war activist. Okay, we cannot obviously end our conversation about the civil rights movement without talking about the Black Power movement, Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, this idea of Black nationalism. His views are much more militant, I would say, than the views of the more nonviolent work of Dr. King. And there are many who had worked with Dr. King, including Cora and SNCC, who are looking for something a little more what they would consider active in terms of airing their frustrations. And Malcolm X was very smart and tempered with what he said, but he meant what he said. He would say something like this up here: be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. And in his mind, people had been putting hands on African Americans in this country for quite some time, and it was time to fight back. Again, though, Dr. King and the nonviolent movement of the 60s doesn't say we don't feel as though we have been physically harmed. They say the best way to affect change is nonviolently. He will be assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam in 1965, as some of his views had begun to diverge from their views. But there is controversy around the circumstances of his death that persist even today. And we also know that Dr. King will ultimately be assassinated. And there's a really good discussion of the assassination that's in Eyes on the Prize. And so instead of me just like blabbering on about the events, I think I will play this video. It's about 9 minutes long. So, yes.
At the end of March in Memphis, Tennessee, garbage workers, who were mostly black and grossly underpaid, were out on strike. The Kerner Commission had just released its famous report, warning our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal.
These men who were really at the low rung on the totem pole just got tired of being treated less than men. And if you notice that sign they had, it didn't say peace, it didn't say freedom, it didn't say justice. All it said was, I am a man.
But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly.
Martin Luther King, the nation's preeminent civil rights leader, came to Memphis to express moral support for the men on strike.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights.
On March 28th, the Memphis police were out in force. About 12,000 demonstrators gathered to march down Beale Street in support of the garbage workers. King was planning to lead a Poor People's March on Washington that summer, an ambitious new campaign focusing on economic justice. Memphis was supposed to be the dry run.
There was a group of young guys called the Invaders, some of whom were on the FBI's payroll. We didn't know that at the time. But they were there really to stir up trouble. These young guys had taken the sticks off of the placards, started breaking out windows, and they started the riot. And, once you start, everybody gets in it. And rather than try and isolate the people who were rioting, the police just waded into the crowd, just beating people indiscriminately, just beating them. It was horrible. Martin was taken up physically, put in a car, and taken to the closest hotel for his own safety. And he said, we've got to have a peaceful march. If we don't do it here, we can't go to Washington.
King was despondent. Others were losing faith in his nonviolent philosophy. Maybe his time was past. Martin Luther King was at a crossroads. Despite doubts, despite death threats, he refused to turn back. On the night of April 3rd, he appeared before a packed congregation at Mason Temple.
It was thundering and lightning, and the rain was coming hard. And Martin didn't take a text. We called it a mountaintop speech. He just started speaking extemporaneously. And I'd not heard him. Of all the times I'd heard him speak, I'd not heard him like this.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I feel that he was going through a purging of his fear, that I no longer fear death. He always said he would not live to be 40. He didn't think he would. He wanted to, but he never thought he'd live to be 40 years old. He was 39 when he was killed.
The next day, meeting with aides at his motel, King seemed rejuvenated. As evening approached, he stepped out on the balcony to talk with Jesse Jackson and others.
And we're on our way to Reverend Billy Kyle's home for dinner. And I remember we had our little band there from Chicago, Ben Branch and some musicians. And we were going to have a big rally at Mason Temple that night after dinner. So I was coming across the courtyard, and he said, "Jesse, we're late for dinner." I said, "Doc, I've been waiting for you." He said, "But you don't have your tie on." I said, "Doc, you know a tie is not a prerequisite for dinner, just an appetite." He said, "Boy, you're crazy." Then he said to Ben, said, "Play my favorite song tonight for me, Precious Lord." Ben said, "I will." And I said, "Doc," he said, "Yes." And he said, "Yes." The bullet hit right here. And he just knocked him back against the wall, and it was over. Police were coming toward us with drawn guns. We were saying, the bullet came from that way. It couldn't have come from this way. So why are you coming toward us with drawn guns? It came from that way. It came from that way.
In black communities across the country, the reaction to King's assassination was a violent eruption of rage and despair. Rioting broke out in more than 100 cities. 20,000 Army regulars and 34,000 National Guardsmen were mobilized. In Chicago, Mayor Richard Daley ordered police to shoot to kill. Nationwide, 46 people died. Martin Luther King was dead. America was burning. Many feared that the last hope for racial equality and nonviolence had been extinguished.
This seemed like the definitive statement. You know, America tried to redeem itself, and now, you know, they've killed the man who was taking us to the mountain.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired. I am weak. I am worn. Through the
in shock. You know, even though we expected it, when it happened, you know, you didn't know what to do. And we stayed in shock for a very long time. A very long time.
At this point, I had been so knocked out of my middle-class assumptions that I didn't know what would happen. Perhaps the country could be reformed and Robert Kennedy would be president. Perhaps we'd be plunged into a civil war. I'd be imprisoned and killed. It seemed impossible to tell what country we were in and what was about to happen.
And of course, we know Robert Kennedy will be assassinated pretty shortly after Dr. King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Well, Dr. King, not Robert Kennedy. Right, well, no, actually, I was going to say to be continued, but that wraps up the civil rights conversation in terms of the keynote.